Hello, you souls and demons. Welcome to another day, another few stories. These stories in particular, well, they're classified as pure horror stories. So, you know the drill. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. Why Can't You See Them? By James G. Boswell. Officer Bridget McCrae led the small, pale woman into the interrogation room. She pulled out a chair for her at the table, then sat down on the other side. She used a pen to write the woman's name, Allison Derby, and her address on a notepad. Then, with a blank look on her face, she said, "Tell me again why you're here." "I killed 3 people and I'm afraid I'll kill again. You need to arrest me right now," Allison said. "When did the killings occur?" "Today," Allison said in a detached tone and with a distant look. "This all happened today." "Whom did you kill?" "It started with my neighbor, James. He was over at my apartment helping me with plumbing. I don't know what happened. One minute he was putting his tools back into his toolbox, and the next, I was standing over his dead body. My kitchen knife was in my hand and blood was everywhere. I spent the next hour cleaning myself off while trying to figure out what to do. Then, James's wife, Clarissa, came over looking for him. I could tell she was suspicious that he and I might be having an affair. She barged into my apartment and started calling out his name while looking all around. I thought for sure she'd noticed his body on the kitchen floor, but she walked right past it like it wasn't there. Then I blacked out again. When I recovered, I saw her lying on top of her husband with her throat slashed. "So, you killed your neighbors?" "Yes." "What happened next?" "My landlord, Mrs. Harding, knocked on my door a short time later. I knew she was there to collect the rent. And? I opened the door and I stabbed her, right in the stomach, without saying anything. She looked at me with the most surprised expression I've ever seen in my life. The next thing I knew, she was lying face up in my living room with her throat slashed. Her eyes were wide open, glassy like a doll's, staring up at the ceiling." "What did you do next?" "I decided to turn myself in." "Why?" "I didn't mean to kill those people. I don't know why I did it, and I don't want to hurt anyone else. That's why I need you to arrest me." Bridget squinted as she looked Allison up and down. Then she stood up and said, "Wait here for a moment. I'll be right back." Allison nodded. Bridget exited the room, then walked down the hall to her cubicle and sat at her computer. She opened the National Police Database of Criminal Records. Then she typed in Allison's name and address and wrote down the results she found. Next, she went over to an open office door on the side of the room. Stenciled on the door's windows were the words, "Police Chief Anna Polanski." Inside was a woman in a suit who was reading a document from an open file on her large wooden desk. Bridget knocked on the door. Anna looked up and said, "Yes?" "Chief, I've got a weird one here," Bridget said. "Oh?" "Her name's Allison Derby. She came in a few minutes ago confessing to having killed her neighbors and her landlord. She says she doesn't know why she did it." "What do we know about her?" "Not much. She has lived at the same address for 10 years and has no criminal history. She said she stabbed or slashed all her victims with a knife, but I didn't see any nicks or cuts on her hands or fingers like we often see with perpetrators of knife crimes." "Where are the victims now?" She implied that they are still at her apartment. Anna leaned back in her chair and looked up at the ceiling. Then she said, "What do you think?" "I think she's crazy." Anna nodded again and said, "I agree, but we still need to check up on her story. Go to the apartment with her and check it out." "Will do, Chief." Bridget went down the hall and opened the interrogation room door. "Ma'am, let's take a ride down to your apartment. I want you to show me the bodies." Allison said, "Aren't you going to arrest me?" Not yet. We need hard evidence that someone has committed a crime before we can arrest them. I see. Well, are you going to put me in handcuffs? Should I? Allison used her key to unlock the door, opened it to let Bridget inside. Bridget proceeded to then look around the small one-bedroom apartment. The first thing she noticed was its sparseness. There were no decorations and only a single chair in the living room and a bare mattress in the bedroom. You said you live here, ma'am, she asked. Yes. I've lived here for several years, but that's not important. You see the bodies and now you know I was telling the truth. Now hurry up and arrest me. Confused, Bridget said, What bodies? Allison's eyes grew wide. The bodies, she said. There are 2 in the kitchen and one right next to where you're standing in the living room. Bridget looked at the floor all around her. I didn't see any bodies, ma'am, she said. Not here, not in the kitchen, or anywhere else in the apartment. Allison shook her head, closed her eyes and squeezed her temples. Then she stomped into the kitchen, pointed at the floor and said, You mean you don't see these 2 dead bodies right here? A man and a woman? Bridget took a step toward the kitchen. As she moved, Allison gasped and said, You just stepped across the body. You lifted your leg up over it. Bridget sighed and said, Ma'am, like I said, there's nothing here. Not in the living room, not in the kitchen, nowhere. Allison's eyes began to tear up as she put her hands to her face and said, No, this can't be happening. Why can't you see them? Why? Ma'am, are you using any medications or substances? Allison shook her head and said, Why can't you see them? You should be able to see them, you should. Bridget turned her head to speak into her police radio. Dispatch, I'm at a suspect's apartment investigating a possible 187, but it was a false alarm. I'm headed back now. When she turned back around, she saw Allison standing in the kitchen doorway. She had an intense look on her face and held a long kitchen knife in her hand. You're lying about not being able to see the bodies, she said. I don't know why, but you are. If you want to arrest me, then you leave me with no choice. She raised the knife and screamed, pouncing at Bridget with surprising speed. Bridget pulled her gun and fired 2 shots into Allison's chest at point-blank range. She collapsed at the floor in a heap, the knife clattering to the ground. Bridget looked down at where she'd fallen and gasped. Laying beneath her now were 2 other bodies. One was a man and the other was a woman. Blood covered their skin and clothes. What the... Bridget said. Then, with her lower lip trembling, she turned her head and looked out into the living room. There, laying in the middle of the carpet, was the body of a middle-aged woman. She had gaping wounds in her stomach and neck, a look of surprise frozen upon her face. Her hands shaking, Bridget reached for her radio. She said, Dispatch, I need immediate backup on a 187 at my current location. The perpetrator attacked me and I shot her. I believe she's dead. A voice crackled through the radio. Officer McRae, your last communication indicated the 187 call was a false alarm. I know, but I made a mistake. Get someone out here as soon as possible. While she waited, Bridget examined the 3 new bodies in the apartment. They looked like they'd been dead for about a day. A short time later, there was a knock at the door and then opened. 2 police officers stood in the doorway, their hands on their holsters. One leaned his head into the apartment and said, Bridget, you in there? Yes, I'm here, she answered, in the kitchen. The officers entered and walked into the kitchen. Seeing them, Bridget said, Scott, Karen, I'm so glad you're here. Then she held her hand out toward the floor and said, The one on top is the perp, the others are her victims. The others looked at each other, then back at her. Where? They said in unison. Bridget scoffed and said, You've got to be kidding me. There are 3 bodies laying right here and there's another out in the living room. They both gave her strange looks. Karen shook her head and said, This isn't funny, Bridget. I'm not joking. There are 4 bodies in this apartment. Why can't you see them? Scott took a step forward and tripped, catching his toe on the leg of one of the bodies. He recovered his footing and continued another few steps. Then he opened a cabinet and looked inside like nothing had happened. Bridget said, "There, Scott, you tripped on the body of a dead man as you walked across the floor." He looked at her like she was crazy and said in a quiet, concerned voice, "No, I didn't." Karen rolled her eyes and shook her head. Then she said into her radio, "It's a false alarm after all. Officer McCrae must be seeing things." "No, I am not seeing things. You tell dispatch there are 4 bodies in this apartment right now." Bridget pulled out her gun and pointed at Karen, who stood unmoving, staring at her with surprise. Scott said, "Calm down, we'll figure everything out." Then he reached toward Bridget's gun. Bridget pointed it at him and shot him in the neck. He let out a gurgling sound and slid down against the counter, his blood spurting all over the walls. Bridget pointed the gun back at Karen, but Karen pulled out her own gun and shot Bridget in the head. Bridget pulled her trigger at the same moment, hitting Karen in the leg. Karen collapsed in agony as Bridget fell to the floor, dead. Then Karen sat up against the kitchen door frame and looked at her leg as blood sprayed out. She reached for her radio and said, "Dispatch, send an ambulance. Officer McCrae shot me and Officer Smith. I'm bleeding everywhere. I need help, now." A voice crackled through the radio. It sounded muffled to Karen as she began losing consciousness. The last thing she saw was a pile of 3 bodies lying in the middle of the floor next to those of her colleagues. Police Chief Polanski sat at her desk in the police station reading the newspaper. She scanned the headlines until she stopped at one and frowned. It said, 3 police officers missing after responding to a reported murder. She shook her head as she read the rest of the story. It said, police officers Bridget McCrae, Karen Johnson, and Scott Smith are missing. They were last heard from after responding to a report of a suspected murder at a downtown apartment. Police say the officers gave conflicting accounts of events at the scene. Then all 3 ceased radio communication. When backup arrived, they found the apartment empty. Also, the tenant, the landlord, and 2 other people living in the same building are missing as well. Police say they suspect foul play. This one is called The Specimen, written by Old Bean Sprout. Dr. Agnes Ambleton, head of entomology at the Bradford Museum of Natural Science, had always had an infatuation with bugs. Even as a child, her desire to collect and study various insects from the garden was something her mother had always found rather unsettling. Creepy crawlers, her mother had called them. She would chastise young Agnes for keeping jars of crickets and pill bugs around the house, and for carrying spiders outside when the older woman tried to step on them. It simply wasn't natural, her mother had told her. But young Agnes understood insects in a way she never quite managed to understand people. Over the years, she had turned this fascination into a rather successful career. She had earned her doctorate and had been granted her own lab deep in the archives of the Bradford Museum. It wasn't much, but it was hers. And it came with a fairly substantial grant with which to travel in search of new and fascinating species. Agnes had been all over the world. She had studied cave spiders in Madagascar, tree hoppers in Brazil, and giant weta in New Zealand. And she was currently on the cusp of her proudest achievement: an all but unknown species of moth found deep within the rainforests of Borneo. Somewhat sinisterly named the rigor mortis moth due to the fact that the only evidence found of its existence were often deceased specimens. It was for this reason that very little was known of the moth. Agnes had been sent to Borneo to study the species and had returned with the single greatest discovery of her career: a living specimen. It had been gifted to her, housed in a small glass jar by a local monk. Though her grasp of the local language was limited, she had understood that it came with a warning: a single condition that the recipient never remove the lid. The moth was far more exquisite than she could ever have imagined. It was a mesmerizing opalescent white, with a very intriguing pattern of glimmering eyes on its wings. While eye markings were a rather common defense pattern among moths, Agnes marveled at how these seemed almost to follow her as she moved across the room. It was a truly fascinating species, and she would be the first to actually observe and study it. She sat at her desk in the archives of the now closed museum, foot tapping to her usual classic rock playlist as she pondered what life would soon be like for her as one of the world's leading entomologists. The archives housed various labs and offices, all interconnected by a veritable maze of corridors. Agnes loved it down there. Not just because it held her own beloved lab, but because it reminded her of some mystical fortress with its vaulted wooden paneled doors, crown molding and marble tile floors. It felt almost enchanting, like the elegant halls of a Gothic mansion. She had the building to herself tonight, and how she loved peaceful evenings alone in her lab. She had only just made it back to the States mere hours ago with her findings, but she simply could not wait another day to begin documenting this new insect. Despite the warning given to her, she couldn't bear the thought of leaving the moth in that tiny jar to slowly waste away and die. In fact, she had already prepared a small enclosure for her new specimen. It was an antique mahogany terrarium she had found in a dusty corner of the archive some time ago. She had cleaned it up and even scoured the museum grounds with her flashlight in search of some appropriate plants and flowers to place inside. She now stood over her completed project, beaming with pride. It looked like a tiny, ornate Victorian greenhouse. Perhaps a little impractical, but it was somehow fitting to house such an elegant and graceful insect. This is it. She leaned down to peer into the jar on her desk and smiled at the little moth. Your new home. She grasped the jar tightly and loosened the lid with a sharp twist, gently tilting the mouth of the container into the open terrarium door. She removed the lid from the jar and allowed the moth to flutter into the terrarium, where it perched atop a twig and adjusted its footing to watch her as she closed and sealed the glass paneled door of its new prison. It gazed through the glass as if taking in the framed bug collections lining the walls of Agnes's lab and fluttered its wings anxiously. Agnes sank into her chair and rested her chin on her folded arms, gazing lovingly at her new pet. Aren't you beautiful? The moth shuddered a bit, flitting its wings. As it did so, Agnes noted a small cloud of glimmering dust drift from its body, dissipating into the air. Fascinating. She leaned in, pressing her nose to the glass pane of the terrarium door as she watched the small creature in wonder. She sucked in a deep breath and nearly choked on the overpowering stench of rot, wafting through the small terrarium vent. The strong smell made her eyes burn and water. She sneezed and immediately reached for a tissue, blowing her nose. When she looked back to the terrarium, the moth seemed to be watching her almost intently. She was wondering if the foul-smelling powder the moth had just released could be a possible defense mechanism to help ward off predators, and her heart fluttered at the opportunity to record her first observation of this new species. She rummaged frantically in a drawer for a pen with which to begin documenting this strange occurrence. Just as she began to scratch out a few notes to type into her laptop later, the lights went out, plunging the building into darkness. All of the equipment in the building hummed to a halt until the music playing on Agnes's smartphone was the only sound to be heard. "Damn it," she cried. "You have got to be kidding me." Of all the times for a power outage, she sighed and pulled her flashlight out of her bottom drawer, flicking it on to illuminate a small circle of her bug collection on the far wall. The occasional blackout was not uncommon in this part of the city, and she had a box of LED camping lanterns around here somewhere for just this reason. She slid her chair away from her desk and made her way to the cabinets at the far end of the lab. A small headache began to form at the back of her skull as she did so. If only she could remember which cabinet she had stuffed the lanterns into. As she rummaged through the lab, she thought she heard a sound out in the hallway. She paused, listening intently. A voice, perhaps? Had someone returned for a forgotten item in their office? She peeked out of her lab, aiming her flashlight down the dark corridor. "Hello?" she called. A soft tapping sound echoed down the hallway from somewhere in the archives. "Hello?" she called again. She left her lab and took a few steps down the corridor. Surely it was just an employee she had overlooked, startled from their office by the power outage. But she could not shake the feeling of unease that was beginning to bloom in her chest. Another quick sound in the darkness startled her into almost dropping her flashlight. She felt her heart skip in her chest as she whirled the light around madly, sending shadows dancing through the hall. Had that been a muffled cry she just heard? Certainly it was just her imagination. As she rounded a corner, a soft crunch underfoot drew her attention downward. She raised her shoe. Leaves? The tile floor was littered with them. She lifted her gaze and was stunned to find that the walls were cloaked in vines and roots from floor to ceiling, as if she were no longer in the winding corridors of the museum archives, but instead were exploring the jungle ruins of some ancient civilization. She blinked, her mouth agape. How could this be? Was she dreaming? Upbeat music drifted down the hallway from her open office door in eerie discordance with what she was seeing. Beneath the music, she heard a soft tapping somewhere further down the corridor. "Hello?" She mouthed silently into the darkness, scarcely aware of the fact that she had not actually spoken the word. Her pulse thundered wildly in her ears, and she had the distinct feeling that anything could sneak up behind her and she would not even hear it over the sound of her pounding heart. She spun frantically in the darkness and screamed as her flashlight fell momentarily upon a hunched silhouette as it darted around a corner up ahead. She stood frozen, the beam of her flashlight pinned on the corner where the figure had disappeared. She pulled in her breath in short gasps as she desperately tried to hear over the sound of her pulse in her ears. As she watched, an eye peered around the corner approximately 2 feet up from the floor. She could not see enough of the face to determine what she was looking at, but there were live specimens enclosed in multiple labs throughout the archives. Perhaps an animal had gotten out. Agnes raised the flashlight, hoping to illuminate whatever it was. As the light fell across the squirming shape, it seemed to shrink away. Whatever it was emitted a sharp clacking sound, like dry sticks being slapped together in fast succession. Agnes shivered as the noise intensified, echoing off the surrounding walls, shrill and piercing in the stillness of the empty archives. It had to be a loose specimen from one of the biology labs. But what on earth was it? She inched cautiously forward, her movement causing the creature to duck back out of sight. As she leaned around the corner, the shrill rattling ceased abruptly and a pale shape launched itself at her with a frenzied shriek. She caught a glimpse of fangs and claws and scrambled back around the corner, taking off down the hallway. As she ran towards what would have been the stairway leading to the main entrance of the museum, the terrain became more and more unrecognizable. The familiar oak molding and marble floors of the museum archives gave way to dirt and stone, punctuated by the towering trunks and gnarled roots of massive trees, cloaked in vines. She could hear the footfalls of the strange creature behind her as she ran blindly, slapping vines and cobwebs out of her way. "This can't be real! This can't be real!" she cried breathlessly to herself as she fled. Ahead she saw a break in the trees, a clearing. Her panicked brain told her to run for it, so she did. She could tell that she had just put some distance between herself and her pursuer, but she did not dare glance over her shoulder to see how much. She knew that without obstacles she could gain speed. She simply had to make it to the clearing ahead. She broke through the tree line and immediately her heart fell. It was not a clearing at all. It was a cliff. She skidded desperately to a halt at the edge of the yawning cavern. Panting heavily, she craned her head to look over the edge. It was a sheer 100-foot drop into a raging river pocked with rocks and debris. Oh no, 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 no! She spun around. She could hear the creature tearing through the brush, rapidly catching up to her. This must be a dream. It had to be a dream. She glanced over the edge once more at the rushing water far below. If this was a dream, there was only one way out. She had to startle herself awake, she rationalized. Through the tree line, she could see the dark shape of the creature barreling towards her. whipping the underbrush as it made a beeline for its prey. Only one way out, she told herself. And as the creature broke free of the bushes, she took in a deep breath and stepped back off the ledge. She felt her toes leave the edge, and in that instant of frozen weightlessness, she saw not a cliff amongst jungle, but the moonlit roof of the Bradford Museum of Natural Science. She managed only a small cry of surprise, the last sound that would escape her lips before the wind sucked the breath from her lungs as she plunged down into the darkness. Her body was discovered on the steps of the museum by a passerby the next morning, twisted and broken, her face still bearing the look of shock and bewilderment that betrayed her last emotions as she died. The museum remained closed in the following days, pending the investigation, but in the end, it was determined to be a suicide. Those who knew her could not imagine why she would do such a thing. Such a bright young woman, they whispered amongst themselves as they read the news. She had such a promising future. What could have driven her to throw it all away? Deep within the archives of the museum in Agnes Ambleton's darkened office, the moth perched in its enclosure, peering out at the stacks of books and papers, and the rows of petrified insects pinned in lines behind glass upon the walls. It flitted its wings, releasing a fine glimmering slit into the air around it, and waited.